Hi, I'm Terry Tayler. I'm a naturalist who has been studying the coastal forests of British Columbia for about 45 years or so. And even though you may have walked through forests like of this nature many times, what I'd like to show you are things you may have seen many times but may never have noticed, common things that most people don't see, but once you see them you can't forget them. So let's start our walk. Hi, now I'd like to say something about the Pacific coastal rainforest that occurs on the western side of the coast mountains along the coastal areas of British Columbia. What we're looking at now in the distance are some of the common trees that occur in a forest of this nature, where we get a lot of rainfall, and we're also getting seepage coming off down the slopes of this gully here. And we're in what's called the Heritage Forest in the town of Qualicum Beach on the east coast of Vancouver Island. Now, this is a drier area, but the forest we are in, looking down on the gully, there's more water because the water is running into this gully. And so the trees you're seeing in the background are western red cedar trees and the hemlock tree, the western hemlock tree, and also with some Douglas fir trees. Now the two first trees I mentioned to you, in a wetter area, the cedar and the hemlock, they can maintain themselves because they need lots of moisture, and they start out growing under the cover of other trees where it's fairly shady. The Douglas fir trees require mineral soil and sunlight to start growing, so they are not so common in the gullies, but away from this area you'll find Douglas fir trees. And now I'd like to say something about what an old-growth forest is. An old-growth forest, in our definitions that we use in this province, is a forest generally that has trees over 200 years old. And it can go anywhere from 200 up to about 1,000 years or so. Now, what I'm standing beside is an old-growth Douglas fir tree, probably about 300 years old. And it's been through a number of fires probably. On the side here, there's some charcoal from one of these fires, which probably occurred 150 years or so ago. All this area down here is from the fire scar. You notice also that the bark is incredibly thick compared to most of the other trees. This is because the Douglas fir is adapted to growing in areas where the fires occur every 100 years or so, and it has very thick bark to protect itself against fire conditions. This is a close-up view of some of the components that go into building the forest floor. These will be recycled back into the ground again by the fungi and go in future years and decades to build new trees. I've got some of the lichens that have fallen from the canopies of the trees. There's the leaf lichens there, and there's some of the long old man's beard type lichen, all from the tops of the trees. There's the cones of the Douglas fir trees here. There's bits and pieces of branches, and there's some bits and pieces also of the brown cubical wrought wood that the fungi have broken down. All this is going to go back into the ground again to start the cycle over again in the recycling process. So we've already looked at logs and tree trunks. Let's look at what the soil layer in a forest like this looks like. This is a typical soil layer Here's all the twigs and branches and cones and needles and things that have fallen off the trees over the last few years. This is the surface layer before the fungi and the bacteria start to rot it down. If we dig down a little deeper, you can start to see the soil layer below the duff, what's called the duff layer on the top, where the microorganisms are returning this sort of material into the ground again to send nutrients into the trees nearby. Now we've got a number of kinds of cones here. We've got cones of the little tiny cones are the western hemlock cones. The bigger ones are the Douglas fir cones. So we've got Douglas fir cones here, and we have the hemlock cones. And here's a piece of wood. You can see all sorts of things just by chance as you walk through the woods. There's a piece of wood from one of these rotten logs showing what originally were the annual rings on this tree a century or more ago. And here's another log in a more advanced decay stage than the one we saw before. It's much more rotten. And you notice that the wood breaks apart in these more or less rectangular shaped pieces. It's called brown cubical rot. As the cellulose is rotted out, shrinkage takes place because all you have left is the glue that was holding the cellulose together. And so it comes out in these cubes. But this is the same sort of rot that we saw in the other one, but a more advanced stage, forming these cubes of rotten wood. And this sort of material, called lignin, that is the glue that holds wood together, is very resistant to decay, so it can stay in the forest soil for centuries. And we'll look at another log, or what used to be a log in a much more advanced stage of decay. And you notice that you can hardly see the log anymore. It's almost down to the soil level. It's covered all over with the mosses. This particular one is called the cotton moss. And but across the surface, it's covered by these roots. Now these roots are not part of the original tree. These roots are tree roots that have come out from a tree nearby to capture the nutrients within this log, and they've grown through the log, capturing the nutrients and minerals that were originally part of the old tree, taking it back to the new tree, so that these fungi are the instigators of this transfer process, because they've rotted down the old wood, making it available for this tree that is producing the new roots. And another thing you're likely to see as you go through an old forest is something like this. You notice that these things sticking up here are good solid wood. They're called pitch sticks because they are full of resin and they will burn quite readily. The old pioneers and the First Nations people in this area used to use these to start fires because they will smolder and burn for a long time quite readily. But you notice the rest of the material down here is really rotten. The whole stuff on the ground is made out of rotten reddish wood. That's because the fungi were able to rot down the main part of the tree, the stump that was here originally, but this part of the tree is full of resin, and resin is has antibiotic compounds in it and prevents decay. So this is almost as good quality wood as the wood in the original tree. And it was a very large tree. It was several centuries old when it came down or was cut down. And most of it is now all just little pieces of brown decayed wood, but this is still in reasonably good condition. these pitch sticks. And now I'd like to show you something about these three common trees that are occurring in this woodland here. The first one we're going to look at is the hemlock tree. And you notice that it has fairly thin bark. It has grooves down it, but it's fairly thin. It's not particularly fire resistant. And you can tell the hemlock from the Douglas fir tree, even when it's young, is because the bark is all brown, whereas the Douglas fir differs from this, which we will see later. And then these are the cones of the hemlock, very small little cones that are produced in very large numbers. And this is what happens to an old stump. This tree was logged about a century ago, and it's been now occupied by a hemlock tree. Hemlock trees often grow on old stumps and logs. The stump it's growing on was a Douglas fir tree. Now, Douglas fir trees don't start on rotten logs. They start on mineral soil, sandy, gravelly soil, usually after a forest fire. And but once the tree dies down, it gets occupied by hemlock trees, and here you can see the tree started here. These are the roots reaching down to the ground. So as the stump rots out, if this thing can get its roots into the soil strongly enough, it can survive, but it does have a problem once its support has gone. But the roots are beginning to strengthen off, going down into the soil to strengthen this thing so it can manage to survive. On the bottom, there's some fire material here as well, charcoal from when a fire came through. So this is still one of our remaining old growth Douglas fir trees here. This tree is 300 to 400 years old. It's been growing that long, and you can see it looks a little different from the tree we saw before because the bark is very, very thick. It's gone through several forest fires. Here is the evidence of a fire that occurred in this forest a century or more ago. The black coating on here is the charcoal from one of those ancient fires. And over here on the side is a fire scar. The fire that originally produced this charcoal here damaged this part of the tree. You see, it looks different from the bark over here. This is a fire scar caused by the fire that raged through here at one time. And have you ever looked at branches of different kinds of trees? The Douglas fir tree has very brittle branches because the lower branches cannot grow under shade. So it gets rid of its branches. It's called self-pruning. They're very brittle. And if you look at this, see how readily they break. Whereas the hemlock tree and the cedar tree, they can grow under shade, so they don't break in this nature. Now, another thing about the branches up high in the trees is that they are a substrate for other organisms. These are leaf lichens, and this was on the ground, but it didn't grow on the ground. And when you walk through a forest like this, you find all sorts of lichens on the ground, but they're growing up in the canopy because most lichens need lots of sunlight, and when they fall on the ground, they will perish. They don't grow on the ground. So this is a piece of the Douglas fir branch from high up in the trees where it got lots of sunlight, and then it broke off and fell to the forest floor. The next tree we're going to look at is the cedar tree, the western red cedar tree. This is a cedar tree here. The bark looks somewhat similar to the hemlock, but it's long and stringy, much more stringy than the bark on the hemlock tree. It's also brown in color. If you can look closely at it right there, there's brown, there's no white in it. And this is the remains of one of the shoots of the cedar tree. You notice that the tree trunks have a gray coating on them. This gray coating is an actual living organism. It's called the dust lichen, and it's a species of lichen that lives in very low light conditions and also areas where there's very little water. And it utilizes water vapor, and there's lots of water vapor around here when it's moist. And when it's rainy around here, it may be dry because of the angle of the trees and the thick covering, but there's always a lot of moisture in the air, and so this particular organism, this lichen, utilizes not liquid water, but it uses water vapor. And if you pour water on this surface, the water doesn't soak in, it beads and runs off. It's quite fascinating, these little beads of water that will stay on the surface but will not soak in. And now we're looking down into a creek gully, and you notice that there's quite a bit of difference between this area we're standing at the top of the gully and the green vegetation at the bottom of the gully. We're standing on what foresters refer to as a water shedding site. Down below is a water receiving site. So it's dry soil on relatively where we're standing, so it's bare. It doesn't have too much vegetation. As the water gets to the bottom and around the creek, you've got lots of water right through the season, so you've got a dense covering of shrubs and vegetation in the bottom of the creek gully down below there. And here's one of the common plants that you're going to see when you on your walk in the woods on the coast here, salal. And salal has these evergreen leaves, very, very common on the coast, and has good edible berries as well. And you notice that it's growing in a reasonably dry sort of area. There are different areas in the woods where different kinds of plants will be growing. Now we're looking at a lot of shrubs and ferns and things. There's this little particular shrub right here is called salal. Thick green leaves to gather lots of sunlight. There's a little red huckleberry in there. There's a fern called the bracken fern. And you may wonder, in this particular spot, why does it look so different from the other areas we've been looking at where there's bare duff on the forest floor? The reason is this is an opening in the forest. The sunlight is coming through, and in a forest, openings of this nature, when trees come down, are very important to maintaining forest health, because you can't grow shrubs of this nature in a luxuriant population like this under the shade of coniferous trees. So when the trees die and go down, for the forest, this is a good thing that happens, because this maintains biodiversity. So you can see how different the forest floor looks when it's in the sunshine than when it's in the shade. I'd just like to sum up what we've been seeing around here, and just show you some of the wonders to end off in our forest here. This is a fallen tree which is adding its nutrients back into the ground again to create a new forest. Even though it is a dead tree, what's inside the tree is still alive. There are fungi, there are insects, eating through this tree, sending it back into the ground again to create forests of the future. This is the recycling nature and the life forces that generate what we see in a woodland of this nature. This particular tree probably had root rot. You know, these are the roots of the tree, but you notice they're very broken off and contorted, and many of the trees in our forest die because their roots get rotten, and there are particular fungi that kill the roots of trees. Now that's maybe a disaster for the individual tree, but it's a process that maintains the vitality of the forest and recycles the wood back into the ground again to create new trees. So I hope you've enjoyed our little walk in this local forest, and you can go out yourselves and take a look at some of these processes and things on your own and see things you had never seen before.